The moment Jake's hands touched the yoke, everything changed. The cockpit dissolved into chaos, metal screaming, alarms shrieking, flames dancing across shattered glass. He saw himself dying in horrifying detail. The Cessna spiraling earthward, his instructor unconscious, the ground rushing up like a concrete fist. Then reality snapped back. Captain Wells was speaking normally. The instruments glowed steady green, but the metallic taste of death lingered on his tongue. The vision felt more real than the seat beneath him. "Pre-flight checklist complete," Jake announced, his voice steadier than his trembling hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across Denver Regional Airport's runway, while the Rocky Mountains stood sentinel in the distance. The crisp October air carried the scent of jet fuel and autumn leaves. Captain Sarah Wells adjusted her headset, her weathered face showing the confidence of 2 decades in aviation. "Remember, Jake, this is just a routine training flight. We'll practice some basic maneuvers over the plains, then return for landing approaches." Jake nodded, but his mind replayed the vision, the screaming metal, the smell of burning fuel, the terrible certainty of death. His palms were slick with sweat as he gripped the controls. The Cessna 172's engine hummed steadily, a sound that should have been comforting but now seemed ominous. "Tower, this is November 74 Charlie Foxtrot requesting taxi clearance," Wells radioed. "74 Charlie Foxtrot. Taxi to runway 27, wind 240 at 8 knots. Came Mike Chun's calm voice from the control tower. As they taxied, Jake noticed everything with hyperacute awareness. The way sunlight glinted off other aircraft. The distant rumble of a commercial jet taking off. The subtle vibration through the rudder pedals. In his vision, these same sensations had preceded the horror. "You seem tense," Wells observed, her experienced eyes noting his white knuckles. "First solo preparation can be nerve-wracking, but you've logged plenty of dual time." "I'm fine," Jake lied, scanning the horizon for any sign of the turbulence he'd foreseen. The sky was deceptively clear, painted in brilliant Colorado blue with scattered cumulus clouds that looked innocent enough. They reached the runway threshold. Wells ran through the final checks while Jake's mind raced through scenarios. Maybe if he delayed takeoff, or requested a different altitude, or changed their planned route entirely. 74 Charlie Foxtrot, you're cleared for takeoff, the tower announced. Jake's hands trembled as he pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared to life, propelling them down the asphalt. At 65 knots, he pulled back gently on the yoke. The earth fell away beneath them, and with it, Jake's last connection to safety. "Beautiful morning for flying," Wells commented, seemingly oblivious to Jake's internal turmoil. "Let's head east toward the practice area. Altitude 3,000 feet. But Jake had other plans. If the vision was real, he needed to control every variable. Actually, what if we stay at 2,000? Better visibility of ground references. Wells frowned slightly. The lesson plan calls for 3,000, but okay. Your flight training, your choices matter. She didn't notice how Jake's subtle manipulation had begun, the first of many desperate attempts to cheat death. As they climbed to the lower altitude, Jake scanned obsessively for any sign of the atmospheric disturbance he'd witnessed. The vision had shown clear skies turning violent without warning, but perhaps flying lower would help them avoid whatever meteorological monster awaited above. 20 minutes into the flight, Jake felt a false sense of security. The turbulence from his premonition hadn't materialized. Maybe he'd changed the outcome. Maybe death could be outmaneuvered after all. That's when he noticed the radio crackling with weather updates about unexpected wind shear developing over the eastern plains exactly where they were heading. "Denver approach. We're getting reports of moderate turbulence at 3,000 feet over the practice area." Mike Chun's voice crackled through their headsets. Several aircraft requesting altitude changes. Jake's blood turned to ice. The turbulence was manifesting, just at a different altitude than he'd expected. His evasive maneuver had only delayed the inevitable. "Request immediate diversion to the western practice area," Jake said quickly, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Captain Wells turned to study him. "Jake, that's not our planned route. We need to practice these specific maneuvers in the designated area." "Please," Jake insisted, banking the aircraft westward without authorization. "I have a feeling about the weather conditions." The older woman's expression grew concerned, not about the weather, but about her students' erratic behavior. In her 20 years of instruction, she'd seen nervous pilots before, but Jake's actions seemed driven by something deeper than ordinary anxiety. The radio squawked again. "All aircraft be advised. Wind shear alert issued for sectors 7 through 12. Recommend extreme caution." Jake's hand shook as he realized his diversion was leading them directly into Sector 9. Every choice he made seemed to guide them closer to the fate he'd witnessed. The autumn landscape, below golden wheat fields, stretching endlessly under the Colorado sun, looked like a vast cemetery waiting for their arrival. "Jake, your flying is becoming erratic," Wells observed, her instructor voice firm but patient. "Let me take the controls for a moment." "No." Jake's response was sharper than intended. In his vision, losing control of the aircraft had been the beginning of the end. I need the practice. I can handle it." But his overcorrections were making the flight increasingly unstable. When he tried to avoid a small cloud formation, remembering how clouds had preceded the turbulence in his premonition, he put them into a shallow spiral that took precious seconds to recover from. The temperature had dropped noticeably as they climbed, and Jake could smell the crisp, electric scent that often preceded severe weather. His shirt was soaked with perspiration despite the cockpit's chill. "Denver approach, November 7-4 Charlie Foxtrot," Wells finally radioed, overriding Jake's objections. Student pilot requesting vectors around weather. 7-4 Charlie Foxtrot. Turn left heading 270. Descend and maintain 2,000 feet. Be advised, multiple pilots reporting severe downdrafts in your vicinity. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. Descending was exactly what had happened in his vision, the moment when everything went wrong. But Wells was already adjusting the throttle, beginning their descent into what Jake knew would become their grave. "Sarah, wait," he said, using her first name for the first time. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." She looked at him with growing alarm. "Jake, you're hyperventilating. Focus on your breathing." In aviation, panic kills. But Jake wasn't panicking. He was remembering. The metallic taste was back, stronger now, mixed with the acrid smell of electrical systems straining under pressure. The instrument panel seemed to flicker, just like in his vision, though Wells appeared not to notice. Below them, the shadow of their aircraft raced across harvested cornfields, looking like a dark omen speeding toward destiny. Jake tried one more desperate maneuver, pulling up sharply to regain altitude. "Jake, what are you doing?" Wells reached for her controls. "You going to stall us?" The stall warning horn began its terrible song, the same sound that had haunted his premonition. Jake realized with horror that every action he'd taken to avoid his fate had instead orchestrated it perfectly. The vision wasn't a warning to prevent death. It was death announcing its arrival. Outside, the first wisps of turbulence began rocking their small aircraft, gentle at first, like a predator toying with its prey. The Cessna bucked like an angry horse as they encountered the first real turbulence. Jacob's desperate climb had put them directly into the path of a microburst, a violent downdraft that grabbed aircraft and slammed them earthward with the force of an invisible giant's fist. "I'm taking the controls," Wells announced, but Jake's hands were locked on the yoke with desperate strength. "No, I have to fly this," he gasped. In the vision, when you took over double goat's vision, Wells's voice carried a new edge of concern. "Jake, you need to let me help you." The aircraft dropped 50 feet in seconds, causing both occupants to strain against their shoulder harnesses. The engine sputtered momentarily, not from mechanical failure, but from the violent air currents disrupting the fuel flow. Jake remembered this exact moment from his premonition. "Mayday, mayday." He began transmitting. The wells quickly overrode him. "Denver approach, November 7-4 Charlie Foxtrot in moderate turbulence, requesting immediate vectors to smoother air. 7-4 Charlie Foxtrot, turn right heading 090, climb to 4,000 feet, traffic permitting." Jake wanted to scream. Every instruction was pushing them deeper into the atmospheric chaos he'd foreseen. The climb would take them into the heart of the storm system, that disobeying air traffic control wasn't an option. As they climbed, the turbulence intensified. Coffee from Wells's travel mug splattered across the instrument panel, filling the cockpit with the bitter aroma Jake remembered from his vision. The artificial horizon spun crazily, making it nearly impossible to determine their actual attitude. "Focus on the instruments," Wells coached, her professional calm masking her own growing concern. "Don't look outside. Trust your gauges." But Jake's gauges were lying, just as they had in the premonition. The altimeter showed a steady climb while his inner ear insisted they were falling. The compass spun like a roulette wheel, offering no reliable heading. Even the engine temperature gauge flickered between normal and red line, as if the aircraft itself couldn't decide whether to live or die. A massive downdraft caught them at 3,500 feet. The Cessna plummeted like a stone, losing 800 feet of altitude in seconds. Wells's hands joined Jake's on the controls, fighting to level the aircraft before they struck the ground. "Pull up! Pull up!" The automated voice of the terrain warning system began chanting, another sound from Jake's nightmare coming true. They recovered at 1,500 feet, barely 500 feet above the rolling hills of eastern Colorado. Jake's vision blurred with tears of terror and frustration. Every maneuver he'd attempted to change their fate had instead recreated it with terrifying precision. "We need to land immediately," Wells declared, scanning for suitable emergency landing sites. Below them stretched endless farmland flat fields that should have offered salvation, but somehow looked ominous in the gathering gloom. "Bennett Field is 12 miles northwest," she continued, already plotting their escape route. "We can make it if we stay low and avoid the worst turbulence." But Jake knew better. In his vision, the attempted emergency landing had been when everything went catastrophically wrong. The approach had looked perfect until the final seconds, when wind shear had flipped their aircraft like a toy. "No," he said firmly. "We have to stay airborne. Landing is what kills us." Wells stared at him with growing alarm. "Jake, you're having some kind of breakdown. I'm taking command of this aircraft." Her hands moved to her controls, but Jake fought her, creating a dangerous tug-of-war at 3,000 feet above ground. The Cessna jerked left and right as both pilots pulled in opposite directions. "You don't understand," Jake shouted over the engine noise and rattling instruments. "I've seen this before. I know what happens if we land." The radio crackled with urgent transmissions from other aircraft reporting severe turbulence, emergency landings, and requests for priority handling. The entire regional airspace was descending into chaos, with Jake and Wells trapped at the center of the meteorological maelstrom. As if summoned by his desperate attempts to avoid fate, the worst turbulence yet seized their aircraft, throwing them into a violent spiral that would test every hour of their combined training. The Cessna entered an uncontrolled spin at 2,800 feet. Jake's vision became reality as the artificial horizon tumbled uselessly. The engine screamed at redline RPM, and the ground rotated below them like a deadly carousel. "Recover from the spin," Wells shouted over the chaos. "Power to idle. Opposite rudder. Forward pressure." But Jake's muscle memory was corrupted by his premonition. In the vision, standard recovery procedures had failed. Instead of following protocol, he kept power on and pulled back on the yoke. Exactly the wrong response. but the only one that felt right in his terrified mind. "Jake, you're making it worse." Wells's calm professionalism finally cracked. She grabbed her controls and forced the proper recovery sequence, but precious altitude was bleeding away. They were down to 1,800 feet and falling fast. The spin stopped, but their troubles had just begun. The violent maneuvers had stressed the aircraft beyond normal limits. Warning lights illuminated across the panel like a malevolent Christmas tree. Oil pressure was dropping, engine temperature climbing, and electrical systems flickering ominously. "We're going down," Jake whispered, recognizing every detail from his vision. "This is exactly how it happens." "Not if I can help it," Wells replied grimly, scanning for emergency landing options. "They're that pasture at 2 o'clock. We can make it." The field she'd chosen looked perfect. Long, flat, recently harvested corn stubble that would slow their landing roll. But Jake knew it was a trap. In his premonition, the approach to that exact field had looked routine until hidden power lines appeared at the last second, invisible against the autumn sky. "The power lines!" he screamed, pointing ahead. "Can't you see them?" Wells squinted through the windscreen. The field appeared clear, with no visible obstructions. To her experienced eye, it represented their best chance of survival. Jake's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, driven by hallucinations or panic-induced delusions. "I don't see any power lines," she said firmly. "Trust me, Jake. I've made hundreds of emergency landings in training scenarios." But trust was exactly what Jake couldn't afford. In his vision, trusting his instructor's judgment had been fatal. The power lines, nearly invisible wires, carrying electricity to a distant farmhouse, had been waiting like spider silk to snare their aircraft. At 800 feet, Jake made his most desperate move yet. He yanked the yoke hard left, away from Wells's chosen landing site, banking toward a section of highway he'd noticed in the distance. "Jake, no." Wells fought for control. "The road has traffic. Power lines. You'll kill us both." The highway option was indeed suicidal. Cars traveled it at 70 miles per hour, and telephone poles lined both sides like a gauntlet of death. But in Jake's fractured reasoning, it was the one choice he hadn't seen in his premonition, therefore the one path that might lead to survival. Their struggle for control sent the Cessna into another dangerous attitude. The engine, already stressed from the spin and violent maneuvers, began running rough. Black smoke started streaming from the cowling. Not the mechanical failure Jake had foreseen, but a new crisis born from his attempts to avoid the original one. "Engine fire," Wells announced, going through emergency shutdown procedures. "We're going to dead-stick this landing whether we like it or not." The propeller windmilled to a stop, leaving them in eerie silence broken only by the whistle of wind over the wings and the distant wail of emergency sirens. Someone on the ground had spotted their distress. At 400 feet with no engine power, their options had narrowed to physics and physics alone. They would come down somewhere in the next 60 seconds, and no amount of foresight or struggle could change that fundamental reality. Jake looked ahead and saw his vision beginning its final terrible fulfillment. But there was one element he demissed in his premonition, one small detail that might yet offer salvation or seal their doom forever. Without engine power, the Cessna became a glider with the aerodynamic efficiency of a brick. Wells trimmed for best glide speed while Jake sat frozen, watching his premonition unfold with horrible precision. At 300 feet altitude, they had perhaps 90 seconds before impact. "Jake, I need you to help me," Wells said, her voice steady despite their dire situation. "Check the emergency checklist. Secure the cabin. We might walk away from this if we do everything right." But Jake couldn't move. In his vision, these final moments had been chaos screaming, flames, the terrible sensation of falling. Yet now, in reality, there was an almost peaceful quality to their predicament. The engine fire had gone out on its own when Wells shut down the fuel. leaving only the whisper of wind and the steady beeping of their emergency locator beacon. Below them, the Colorado landscape spread out like a patchwork quilt. Harvested fields, scattered farmhouses, the ribbon of highway where Jake had briefly considered landing. Everything looked so ordinary, so unthreatening from their aerial perspective. How could death hide in such pastoral beauty? There, Wells pointed to a freshly plowed field ahead and slightly right. Soft dirt, good length, no obvious obstacles. I can get us down there safely. Jake's blood chilled. This wasn't the field from his vision, but it might as well have been. The approach angle, the wind direction, even the way afternoon shadows fell across the furrows. Everything matched his premonition with terrifying accuracy. "Sarah, please," he whispered. "Choose somewhere else. Anywhere else." She looked at him with compassion mixed with professional determination. "Jake, I know you're scared. We're all scared in situations like this. But I've been flying for 20 years, and I'm going to get us down safely." At 200 feet, Wells began their final approach. The plowed field rushed toward them, dark earth striped with shadows that looked like graves. Jake closed his eyes, unable to watch his vision become reality. "Flaps down," Wells announced, going through her mental checklist. "Airspeed 65 knots. Looking good." But Jake knew better. In his premonition, everything had looked good until the final seconds. The hidden irrigation ditch, invisible from altitude, had waited like an open mouth. The moment their wheels touched earth, the aircraft would cartwheel, breaking apart in a shower of metal and dreams. "Oh no," Wells said quietly. Jake's eyes snapped open. Ahead, exactly where his vision had shown it, an irrigation canal cut across their landing path. Not a small ditch, but a concrete-lined waterway 4 feet deep and 8 feet wide. At their approach speed, hitting it would be like striking a stone wall. "I can see it now," Wells muttered, adjusting their approach. "We'll have to come in steeper, land short of the canal." But landing short meant touching down in a section of field studded with old fence posts, another trap Jake recognized from his premonition. Every option led to the same catastrophic outcome. Death had planned this chess match perfectly, thinking several moves ahead of any human player. At 50 feet altitude, Wells made her final decision. She would attempt to hop over the canal, using the remaining airspeed to clear the obstacle and land beyond it. It was a technique that worked in powered aircraft but had never been successfully accomplished in a dead-stick emergency. "Hold on," she told Jake. "This is going to be rough." Jake gripped his seat harness and prepared for the impact he'd already experienced in his mind. But as they flared over the canal, something unexpected happened, something that hadn't been in his vision at all. A red-tailed hawk, startled by their approach, exploded from the cattails beside the waterway. The large bird struck their windscreen with a sickening thud, spiderwebbing the glass and obscuring Wells's vision at the critical moment of touchdown. In his premonition, Jake had seen mechanical failure, pilot error, and environmental hazards. But he'd never foreseen this random act of nature that would write the final chapter of their story in blood and feathers across a Colorado field. The hawk's impact shattered more than glass. It shattered Jake's last illusion of control. Through the spider web of cracks, he could barely make out the ground rushing up to meet them. Wells, flying blind, could only estimate their height and attitude as the Cessna descended toward its final resting place. "I can't see," Wells shouted, struggling to maintain control as feathers and debris swirled around the cockpit. "Jake, look outside. Tell me our height." But Jake was paralyzed by the realization that his vision had been incomplete. He'd seen the mechanical aspects of their destruction, the impact, the wreckage, the aftermath, but he'd missed the random variables that made tragedy inevitable. Death hadn't needed to orchestrate every detail. It had simply waited for chaos to run its course. The Cessna touched down hard, much harder than intended. The main landing gear absorbed the initial shock, but their speed was too high and their trajectory too steep. They bounced back into the air, giving Jake a fleeting moment of hope that they might still survive. That hope died as quickly as it had been born. The second touchdown collapsed their left main gear, sending the aircraft careening sideways across the plowed field. The propeller, windmilling freely, bit into the soft earth and flipped them inverted in a violent cartwheel that matched Jake's vision with mechanical precision. Time slowed to a crawl as Jake experienced the crash from inside and outside simultaneously. Part of him felt the harness cutting into his shoulders, tasted blood and aviation fuel, heard the terrible grinding of metal against earth. Another part watched from above, seeing their small aircraft break apart like a child's toy thrown in anger. The world went dark for a moment or maybe an eternity. Jake wasn't sure which. When consciousness returned, he found himself hanging upside down in what remained of the cockpit. The smell of avgas was overwhelming, mixed with the earthy scent of disturbed soil and something else, something metallic and final. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, but not quickly enough. "Sarah?" he whispered, but received no response from the crumpled figure beside him. Jake tried to move, but his legs wouldn't respond. Looking down, or was it up, in his inverted world? He saw why. The control panel had collapsed during the crash, pinning him in place with no hope of escape, just as his vision had shown him. But there was one detail his premonition had gotten wrong. He wasn't dying from the impact itself. The crash had been survivable, would have been survivable, if not for what happened next. A spark from the damaged electrical system found the pool of aviation fuel spreading beneath their overturned aircraft. Jake watched the small flame grow larger, felt the first tendrils of heat reaching toward him, smelled the acrid smoke beginning to fill the cockpit. In his final moments, Jake understood the cruel irony of his situation. His vision had been accurate but incomplete. He had tried so desperately to avoid a mechanical death that he decreated the conditions for a different kind of ending entirely. Every choice made to escape fate had instead delivered him directly into its waiting arms. The sirens were very close now. First responders would arrive in less than 2 minutes, close enough to hear his last words, but too late to matter. As smoke obscured his vision and heat began to build around him, Jake's last coherent thought was about the next young pilot who would sit in a similar cockpit, hands steady on the yoke, confident in their ability to control their destiny. Would they receive a vision too? Would they make the same desperate choices that had led him to this moment? The flames reached higher, and Jake's questions dissolved into the Colorado sky, along with everything else he'd ever been or hoped to become. Miles away, at Denver International Airport, another student pilot was completing their first solo flight. Completely unaware that death had just finished one appointment and was already scheduling the next.